Hey, I'm Org, and in this video I'm going to review the Clemson. At Tier 4, this is finally the point where the US destroyer line starts getting awesome. However, if you're a student of history, you wouldn't be too excited about moving from the Wickes up to the Clemson. Historically speaking, the Clemson was only a slight improvement over the Wickes, and even then most of the improvement came about through increasing the operational range of the destroyers, which isn't very useful in the video game. The Clemson was initially going to be a much more ambitious design than what the Americans ended up with. The Wickes had been designed to escort and scout for the battleships of the US fleet, but had found itself in the submarine hunting and convoy escorting role, a job for which it was very unsuited. The Clemson was intended to fix a number of issues that the Wickes had in submarine hunting. The Clemsons were to carry more depth charges and have a longer operational radius to increase time of patrol, but it was intended to lose a fair bit of engine capacity to make space for the extra fuel and depth charges. It was also supposed to have a redesigned stern and hull to increase agility and make for more accurate depth charging, I suppose. However, none of those changes happened. Instead, the Clemson had extra fuel tanks put on the sides of the hull to increase the operational radius, and had slightly more advanced engines giving it an extra 0.2 knots of speed. As I said, not really anything to get all that excited about. The reason that none of these ideas were implemented was simply because the need for destroyers was so great that the US Navy decided that it would rather not slow down production to implement all those good ideas. However, the Clemsons were produced in huge numbers. Well, I wrote this down, so I'm just going to go look it up to make sure I get it right. 156 of them were made, and the later ships actually had improvements over the standard rest of the class. Quite a few were fitted with extra large rudders. They could turn tighter than the regular flush deckers, but lost more speed in the turn. 5 of them had their 4-inch guns replaced by 5-inch guns, the same gun that was used on the Chester class of cruiser, and 2 were fitted with dual 4-inch gun turrets. Later, a number of Clemsons were refitted as minesweepers on mine layers, transport ships, and even seaplane carriers. But for the most part, they are not really all that worth talking about. Got very little relevance on the Clemson in the game. The Clemson-class arrived too late for the First World War, and fairly soon found that its greatest enemy was actually peacetime military cutbacks. The lead ship of this class is a fitting example of this problem. The Clemson was commissioned in December 1919, 13 months after the war ended. After 7 months in active service, it was put into reserve, and was formally decommissioned in June 1922. So the ship spent 7 months in active service and 2 years in reserve. However, the Clemson was later converted into a seaplane carrier and did manage to assist in sinking a German submarine in the Second World War. With 156 different ships to talk about, I'm only going to talk about the most interesting bits of their history. However, the general experience of a Clemson-class destroyer and its crew can probably be gathered from my review of the Sampson and the Wickes class. They're basically mostly used for convoy escorting and hunting destroyers in the Second World War, and got relegated to secondary duties. The first interesting event for the Clemson class was the Honda Point disaster of 1923. In September of that year, 14 Clemson class destroyers of Desron 11 were on exercises off the Californian coast. Just for clarification, Desron is how the United States Navy decided to shorten Destroyer Squadron. Anyway, as they were coming into harbour, the weather turned a bit poor, so they were navigating by dead reckoning, basically plotting where they should be based on their speed course and the time they'd spent on that course. Because these were wartime exercises, they were coming into the harbour at 20 knots in close formation and with radio silence. Which would have all been fine since all the local hazards were known and the currents and tides were well understood. The only issue was that the Great Kanto earthquake of a week before had caused unusual swells in the Pacific, just enough to throw Desron 11's dead reckoning a little bit off. The lead ship slammed into some rocks at the mouth of the harbour, but did sound a siren to alert the following ships of an issue. Unfortunately, there was only 100 metres separation between the ships in the formation, so the second ship ran aground, despite trying to turn. The third ship did not even attempt to turn, hit the rocks and capsized. The fourth, fifth and sixth ships in the formation also ran aground, while the seventh ship became stuck after going to the aid of the crew of the capsized ship. Two of the destroyers hit rocks, but only suffered light damage. 23 sailors died as a result of this accident, and 7 destroyers were written off. It was the worst peacetime loss of ships for the US Navy ever. In 1927, the Clemsons saw their first active service in the Nanking incident. I'm calling it the Nanking incident just to clarify that it's different from the Nanjing massacre or the rape of Nanjing, which happened about a decade later. Anyway, the Nanking incident was a battle against a Chinese army, which was actually very important in world history, but not one you hear about often. Basically, the Chinese nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek had been moving to break the power of various Chinese warlords and the Beiyang government. These forces held the important trading centre of Nanking, and they became a target for the nationalist armies. The Beiyang forces were ordered to withdraw from the city once it became apparent that they could essentially not hold it against the nationalists. However, a number of troops deserted and began looting the city. When the nationalists arrived, a number of their soldiers also began to pillage the city. The US involvement comes from the presence of a large number of foreign nationals who were present in the city at the time. 5 Clemson-class destroyers arrived to protect the non-Chinese citizens, along with a number of Royal Navy ships. The destroyers blanketed large parts of the city with high explosive shells to prevent the advance of Chinese soldiers into areas that foreigners had been evacuated to. The ships also landed Marines to protect these soldiers. As the civilians were being evacuated, the destroyers came under sniper machine gun and the fire from a 3-inch gun, which of course prompted an equivalent response from the destroyers. Took 3 days of looting before the nationalist officers were able to regain control of the soldiers in the city and the violence ended. I was actually having a hard time finding out what the direct consequences of this was. According to Wikipedia, 40 people died in this incident, but considering that the incident involved 13 destroyers and 3 cruisers, plus some gunboats and minesweepers firing high explosive shells into a densely populated city over a number of days, I suspect that those 40 deaths don't actually include the Chinese civilians, or if they did, or they were incredibly lucky. But anyway, why was this important? The main reason is how the nationalist government responded to the incidents. Basically, 2 groups were blamed. The first was the Beiyang government soldiers, and secondly were the Chinese communists. At the time, almost all of the Chinese communists, the Chinese communists, were backing the nationalist government. They largely thought that a China free of imperial oppression and economically developing was the best means to an eventual liberation of the Chinese working class. The army which was attacking Nanking had a large number of communist soldiers and officers, and Chiang Kai-shek, I totally said that wrong, but whatever, placed the blame on the looting on them. A few weeks later, the nationalist forces loyal to him launched a surprise attack on communist elements in Shanghai, leading to about 300 people officially being killed and another 5,000 disappearing, which kind of marked the start of the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, which, well, as we all know, would go on to have some pretty huge consequences for world history. At the start of the Second World War, the Clemson-class was still one of the most numerous classes of destroyer in service, despite being vastly outclassed with their new 1,500-ton designs, including the Farragut, Sims, Mahan, Benson classes. They were also in service by 1941. During the war, the Clemson served in secondary roles, as I said earlier, hunting submarines, escorting convoys, and being minesweepers, mine layers, training ships. However, this was not the case for all of the Clemson-class. Desron 29 in particular stands out. This squadron of 13 Clemson-class destroyers was based in the Philippines at the start of the war in the Pacific, and in the early months of 1942 fought in a series of battles against superior Japanese forces in the East Indies. The first major engagement went actually pretty well when 4 Clemsons attacked a Japanese invasion force at Balikpapan. Fortunately for them, most of the Japanese escorts were actually off hunting a submarine, so the Clemsons were able to have a bit of a field day, sinking 4 of the transport ships and a gunboat in torpedo attacks and damaging a few other ships in the Japanese force before they decided to withdraw. However, this luck was not repeated throughout the rest of the campaign. The Americans tried to repeat their success against the Japanese force heading towards Makassar. However, they came under heavy bomber attack before engaging the Japanese surface forces and essentially had to pull back. A third attempt to disrupt the Japanese landing, this time on Bali, also went poorly for the Allies. This time the Allies waited until most of the Japanese warships had left Bali, hoping to catch the transport ships unguarded as they had at Balikpapan. In the event, the Allied force of 3 cruisers and 7 destroyers from the Dutch and the American navies only encountered 4 Japanese destroyers. But in a night battle, those 4 destroyers proved vastly superior to the Allied forces. Night battles were something that Japanese destroyer crews had trained extensively for. Due to the confused nature of the fighting, the American and Dutch cruisers initially pulled back, leaving the battle between the American Clemsons and the Japanese Asashio-class destroyers. The Japanese torpedoes scored a hit on a Dutch destroyer, sinking it, while the accurate gunfire from the Japanese destroyers basically forced the Clemsons back. The Allies had a number of ships severely damaged, but the Japanese casualties were very light. The destroyer USS Stuart was heavily damaged in this battle, and after an accident while they were trying to repair it in dry dock, it was scuttled by US forces. However, the Japanese later raised this ship and used it as a gunboat until the end of the war. In a 4th attempt to disrupt a Japanese invasion fleet, the Allied forces were essentially smashed and forced to pull back to Australia. This was the kind of famous Battle of the Java Sea, and came only a month after the successful Clemson-led attack on Balikpapan. The Battle of the Java Sea was a series of attempts by Allied warships to inflict damage on the Japanese invasion fleet. Each attack was rebuffed by superior Japanese firepower. The Clemson's role in the battle was limited. They laid a smokescreen to cover the retreating Allied ships and unsuccessfully fired all their torpedoes at the Japanese. USS Pope was sunk by dive bombers 2 days later, after being detached to escort the heavily damaged cruiser HMS Exeter. Around the same time, the USS Pilbury and the USS Edsall were very unfortunate. They encountered a strong Japanese fleet centered around 2 Congo-class battleships. Neither of those Clemsons managed to escape the Japanese, and people didn't actually know what happened to them until after the war, when we could look at Japanese records. Another Clemson from Desron 29 was sunk in the Japanese raid on Darwin. However, most of the 13 destroyers that started off in the Philippines actually survived the war. Basically, everyone that's made it back to Australia, with the exception of that one ship sunk in Darwin, they were transferred back to the Eastern Pacific off the Californian coast to escort convoys, and kind of got, as I said, very much secondary duties from that point on. It's just a case of, the battles of early 1942, they just demonstrated that the Clemsons were too weak in firepower, their torpedoes were incredibly ineffective, and they were too slow and too old to keep up with more modern cruisers, so they were really only suitable for secondary roles. Fortunately, in World of Warships, the Clemson does not go up against ships 20 years younger than it. so it has a much better chance of doing well than those brave crews in the East Indies. The Clemson sits at Tier 4 in the US destroyer line, and coming from the Wickes, at first you won't notice much different from what you were used to. The stock Clemson is basically a Wickes with a slight speed boost. However, the upgrades are what makes the ship awesome. First up, the hull upgrade gets you a 25% increase in combat capacity, which does come in handy, but more importantly it unlocks access to your gun and torpedo upgrades. The torpedo upgrade gives you more powerful torpedoes and 500 meters extra range, which sounds better if you call it a 10% boost to your torpedo range. However, it's the gun upgrade that really makes this ship work. All it does is give you dual turrets, boosting you from a 3-gun broadside to a 6-gun broadside. And with that upgrade, we finally get an American destroyer that's an effective gunboat. It's kind of actually at this point that I realised that the guns on the Samson, Wickes and Clemson are actually really good guns. They fire on a fairly flat trajectory, so they're easy to aim. They have a decent rate of fire and a decent turret reverse, as well as a good chance of starting a fire. The ships just really needed more than 3 guns on a broadside to be effective. The guns on the Clemson will wreck enemy destroyers in no time at all, and will be able to burn battleships and cruisers to death given enough time. The torpedoes are still rather average. The 5.5 kilometer range means that they are only really useful in a few rather limited situations, although the 56 knot speed and 11,000 damage means that they can do good work in those situations. The AA guns of the ship aren't going to do much good, but their range is less than your detection range from aircraft, so you may as well leave them on unless you're hiding in a smokescreen. In terms of agility and survivability, the Clemson is much the same as the Wickes. It is 1 knot faster and has 2,000 more hit points than the Wickes, but it will be spotted around 400 meters further away, so as I said, roughly balances out. As such, my playstyle in the Clemson was much the same as in the Wickes, only a lot more effective. Currently in the Clemson, I have a 69.57% win rate, doing on average 36,500 damage and sinking 1.5 ships per game. In the Wickes, for comparison, the same figures are 43.3%, 19,500 damage, and just under 1 kill per game. What a difference doubling the firepower of your ship makes. However, as I keep saying, those extra guns are the only significant change from the Wickes, which means that the playstyle is actually incredibly similar for these two ships. Basically, I would stay near my maximum gun range and fire high explosive at enemies, hoping to start a fire. However, even without a fire, the 6-gun broadside will still do a fair bit of damage to lightly armoured ships. The range on the Clemson's gun is a little too short to really do this safely, but you have enough agility and hit points to really make a difference with your guns, or at least stay in the fight long enough to make a bit of a difference. The other offensive option is an ambush torpedo attack around islands or from cover. I was constantly looking for opportunities to ambush my enemies, but they didn't work out all that often. Open water dashes into torpedo range can also be successful thanks to the high speed of the Clemson, but as always, wait until your target is alone and distracted, and don't really risk it if the enemy has decent secondaries and you have low hit points. The big threats to the Clemson are the light cruisers, particularly the Kuma. The Kuma can almost keep up with you if it chooses to, which makes it a pretty huge threat. If you see cruisers nearby, best to stay hidden until they are gone, and if that's not possible, keep manoeuvring to make it hard for them to hit you. That's basically what you've been seeing me doing for the last little bit in this video. I was trying not to get spotted by those cruisers. I was just kind of staying just out of my detection range and trying to hunt down those destroyers. Your main targets in this ship are other destroyers. They will all die very quickly under the fire of the guns, and will enable you to scout and spot much more effectively once they are dead. Japanese destroyers are no real threat to you so long as you keep turning to avoid their torpedoes. The Soviet destroyers are more equal to the Clemson in a fight, but they do seem to struggle to hit manoeuvring targets at medium ranges, and at short ranges they have lackluster turret reverse. I think a good Soviet destroyer captain could be a significant threat, but I think that a Clemson will beat an Izyaslav, given captains of equal skill. Battleships are also fairly easy prey for the Clemson. Hanging around 8 kilometers range, they are very unlikely to hit you, while your high explosive broadsides will be doing a little bit of damage and starting fires. It's quite possible to solo kill a battleship in a Clemson, provided you are given enough time. However, you don't really want to be in a situation where you need to kill a battleship without assistance. The Clemson's an excellent scout and escort for larger ships, so it's useful to have them. Well, it's useful for them to have you in front of them, spotting targets and giving them a bit of extra detection range. Well, it's useful for you to have them nearby, just in case you need the extra fire support to provide you cover if you get into trouble. And that's about all I have to say about the Clemson. It's a little bit more than usual, but I did find it to be a very interesting class of ship. Anyway, let's talk about this gameplay. As I said, I've managed to track down where 2 enemy destroyers are. They're both Izokazes, the Tier 4 Japanese destroyer, which, as I said, it's not really a threat in the Clemson. The larger threat is actually the enemy ships sitting about 8 or 9 kilometers away. And they were, for a while, they're lobbing fire at me, but I was maneuvering to avoid it. But they've all actually retreated. I doubt they're retreating from me, they're probably retreating from my team, which means that for the next little bit I'm going to be basically... well, no one's going to be shooting at me, and I'm just going to have a field day against these Izokazes. They're quite slow ships, and well, this one I think I've knocked its engine out 3 times now. Since you see my high explosive shells, got 3 hits, 1200 damage. It doesn't take very long at all to destroy an Izokaze when you're getting those kind of damage rolls. Yep, I start turning away because I see my allies firing torpedoes in that direction, which means I'm only going to be firing 4 guns at them for a little while. But still more than sufficient, and again I took out the engine there. And I start focusing on the other destroyer because I was pretty confident I was going to get the kill there. And again, at this range, very good chance of hitting enemy ships even if they are manoeuvring. And it's fired torpedoes at me, but I was manoeuvring fairly often there, so it didn't even really come close to hitting me. I get a few more hits, but it's put up its smoke screen, so I switch fire to focus on this new this New Mexico class battleship here. And as I said, the shells are good at lightly armoured targets, but I did no damage to that New Mexico. And again, no damage, but I start a fire, which is basically the way you kill battleships in this thing. You have a good fire chance, I believe 6%, which is pretty right. I actually did a bit of damage, 500 or so, which is always helpful. And the New Mexico's firing at me, but at this range, very unlikely to hit. And the way I see it is that that's 6 shells it's fired at me now, which 6 shells it hasn't fired at my allies. So in that sense, I'm actually doing my team a bit of a favour here. I've actually just got my gun range. See, it's a bit short on the Clemson, but manageable. And the New Mexico's stopped firing at me and switched focus to this Omaha, which is far too close, and it's had its engines destroyed, and it's basically not going to be able to dodge any return fire, so I'm expecting this Omaha to die. But I'm back in range, so I continue firing off with my guns. Get a few hits, but again not doing a lot of damage. New Mexico's just far too heavily armoured. I really should be trying to aim it more for the bow and the stern of this ship, but even then I think its armour's still a bit too thick for me to do reliable damage. And I'm getting the occasional damage roll on the superstructure of this ship, like that one right there. But mainly I'm just relying on... I'm just going to keep hitting it until I start a fire, which should happen fairly soon. Oh, we respotted that destroyer. So I'm very low health, and the Izokase is quite slow, so I aim fairly close to it. And we get 1 hit, and that's it, dead. Switch back to the New Mexico. There's only 3 enemy battleships left on the enemy team. Oops, that fired torpedoes at me. But I'm going to be able to dodge them pretty easily. I had turned away after the Izokase was killed because you have to assume it's fired torpedoes at you. And that was the New Mexico dead. So the enemy battleships, they've kind of all lined up here. I use my engine boosts to start, because I really just want to get in range of this New Mexico and do a little bit more damage, and it doesn't actually look like it's going to last that much longer. So yep, I'm heading straight for it. I want to get there as quickly as I can. The Clemson's, oh, it's pretty fast. It gets around the map quickly enough, and the times you have to sit out for it for a bit, they're not that long. If anything, the problem is more the gun range is a bit on the short side, at least compared to, slightly shorter than the Wickes, but compared to the Nicholas and the Farragut and so on, it's quite short. But I managed to set a fire and do 200 damage, which probably means that this battleship's dead, unless it gets very lucky and is able to put those 2 fires out. Nope, it wasn't, and it's dead. Now there's only one Congo-class battleship left, and after having a hand in sinking 2 Tier 6 battleships, a Tier 5 battleship shouldn't really be a threat, especially since I have 5 ships on my team around here backing me up, and we're all basically, well, not we because I'm not firing yet, but all of my allies are firing away at this battleship, so it's really not going to last that much longer. But again, just got to try and close the distance, and unfortunately the Congo is very fast and it was going away from me, so I didn't get any more shots on target, especially since my team decided to capture the base instead of killing that last ship. But I got 3 kills, 9 fires, 108 hits on target, which is pretty good considering that, well, one of those kills was a Tier 6 battleship, the other 2 were destroyers. But 30,000 damage, pretty average in that respect, but I was bottom tier in the game, and that was kind of, especially at the start when I wasn't really commentating, it was actually a good example of how to scout and just use your view range for your team to try and get them some early damage in, and just how to fall back when you're in trouble when I was fighting that Izyaslav early on. And then I just focused down the destroyers, did my thing, killed them, and just added my firepower to the teams when we were killing the battleships at the end. So all in all, it was kind of just a decent example of how to play this ship, even though it kind of was a bit average. That's just what you do in the Clemson. Anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable or interesting, and I'll see you all next time.